Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ravit Show. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today. Please feel free to let us know where you're joining us. And we have a very special guest. It's none other than Andy Dang, who will be on the Ravit Show just shortly. Let me just introduce quickly. Andy is the co-founder and head of engineering at YLabs, the AI observability company on a mission to build the interface between AI and human operators. Uh, Earlier last year, I had Elysia on the show, and we discussed a lot around MLOps, around YLabs, and the mission. And today we'll be talking more around on the sides that will be exploring Andy's journeys, challenges in MLOps versus traditional software engineering, and much more. So super excited. A little about Andy. Prior to YLabs, Andy spent half a decade at Amazon, where he built massive data pipelines for advertising platform, deployed some of the company's first ML applications to production, built the internal machine learning platform, and helped launch the first iterations of SageMaker. Andy holds a master in CS from Tokyo Institute of Technology. He's frequent speaker on topics such as MLOps to building responsible AI systems. So there'll be a lot of talking around it. But also for those who are joining us today, there's good news that we will be. YLabs has been kind enough to offer free swag. What you need to just do is quickly type in hashtag YLabs in the chat. If you go out and type this in the chat, you enter the raffle. By end of the show, we will be announcing the winners. We'll be picking up the winners randomly, and one person has the chance to win a swag from YLabs. All right, let's not make our guest wait anymore. Let's have Andy here. Hey, Andy, welcome to the Ravit Show.
Hi, Ravit. Good to see you. Good
It's
to
such a
see you.
pleasure to it's such a pleasure to
Yes.
have you. And I was just letting the folks know about you, your background, and the work that you've done for Amazon prior to YLabs, and now at YLabs you're doing wonders already. We could see YLabs like flying all over the place, and it's so nice to have someone from YLabs in 2022 again. Earlier it was Elysia, and now it's you. So can't wait to hear about a lot around what you've been building and what are the next plans for YLabs and how MLOps space is evolving. But to start with, why not introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah. So, morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'm not going to repeat what Ravit said about my background, but basically, I started working at Amazon a lot in the big data engineering space, although with the touch of model tuning and A/B experimentation. That's where I got introduced to these challenges of data pipelines and model pipelines and model management. Obviously, back then it was in 2014, so I don't think the term MLOps even existed. And somehow
Right.
I transitioned into the space of building machine learning platform with the experience of data engineering. So a lot of data ops, those skills I took into building the internal machine learning platform for Amazon back then, and that's where I met Alyssa and Sam, the other two co-founders. And
Right.
then that team inspired a lot of SageMaker iteration. I worked closely with them, and eventually we became part of AWS SageMaker as well, where I had the fun of building for an AWS service and iterate on kind of like more like very kind of external customer centric features. And then here I am at YLabs, where I'm my what keeps me awake at night is how to solve this observability problem for both machine learning and the data ops space.
Yes, this is fantastic. Thanks for that lovely detailed information about your work back then and now. And you rightly mentioned about something which is very important, that is about MLOps. And back then, MLOps was not even a term, but in last few years, we have heard it so much, and we still want to learn more about MLOps and how this space is evolving. There are very few advocates out there who are even exploring this very well. So obviously would love to first hear about what was your journey from being a traditional software engineer to working in MLOps space now? How has it transitioned? What's the difference? Would love to know more about it.
Yeah, it definitely, like, if I look at what I'm doing now versus what I was doing back then, even as just an engineer, it's just very kind of different technical challenges. So first of all, everyone knows of traditional software engineer life cycle. I got introduced to like Git life cycle and DevOps, CI/CD life cycle. Those were very valuable lesson for somebody fresh out of college for me back then, and that kind of, those are really like, you got to learn this discipline and practices around agile software development and software management. And as part of that, I got introduced to machine learning because the team I was working at also deployed a lot of models and they were running a lot of machine learning experiments. I did
Right.
not really view it as an MLOps, like the term didn't exist. I didn't consider how to do monitoring and how to observe this data. It was very done in very traditional software engineering way. So the way you do it is you think about Prometheus, for example. You emit metrics to something like Prometheus, and then you monitor it in a like Grafana like that dashboard, or log information into Elk in a log stash part. And so that part was very good exercise at the beginning for me to have the discipline. So
Right.
I think that's something, jumping forward a bit, the MLOps space still trying to figure out is our discipline around deployment and management of model life cycle. You see some of the work in the open source community around this, like I think
Right.
DBT, for example, is a good example of that, although that overlaps with the data ops space a lot as well. So anyway, back to my journey. Um, I actually transitioned into the data engineering and data ops space a lot,
Right.
like first, and that's where, because machine learning starts with data. So if you want to work in machine learning, I encourage you to acquire
Exactly.
like at least the breadth of the tooling in the data ops space. Maybe not necessarily become maybe a Kafka, Apache, Spark engineer in depth, but at least have the understanding, because that's where the data is coming from. Although the data stack is changing, so that's a challenge with today's transition, is that you have to also be aware of things like prefect or maybe Airbyte. Those are on the rise in terms of technology, or Snowflake. So, but that's where I would start, is to start with the data ops stack, and then you can learn at, of course, like learn about things like what it means to deploy a model,
Right.
and the model deployment pipeline that comes as a next step, like MLflow or Qflow. Those are good experience. I think they're still in flux, so not I don't think you need to like commit yourself to one thing or another.
Right.
uh, and then of course, that once you figure out where your interests lie in, because MLOps, to be honest, is still while it's still in its infantry, it's still very big and a lot of technology that you can touch. Like,
Exactly.
people do it in so many ways. We know companies deploy machine learning from like build it in Python, but deploy it in Golang or Java, and so having a kind of a breadth of expertise would help you transition.
Right. I think these are fantastic insights coming firsthand from someone who's, worked definitely in the space, in the traditional space of software engineering, in something which is obviously very different, very new, very naive, to be honest, and that is MLOps. And I'm sure the folks here would also love to hear more around, what has been the journey where, what are the key differences actually that you have seen in the MLOps space from that you look at the traditional software engineering? Like, what has been like the key differences that you would mention?
So I think that this is like my engineering background. I'm going to speak from a kind of engineering very driven aspect, where I know that some folks who come on the show, they have more like a traditional machine learning background, whereas my
Right.
background is really engineering driven. So I think a lot about execution, how to execute and how to actually deploy this in practice. So the
Right.
first thing I see about MLOps that is, it actually has a lot of overlaps with data ops space, by the way, is
Hmm.
that the curse of dimensionality. In software, traditional software, the number of metrics you want to monitor is a lot more limited. CPU usage, response rate, error code, those sort of things. Well, they're a lot, but they're not unlike they're not like an exploding number of metrics like the machine learning or data ops space. So take an example is that's why you see companies like Datadog, they charge, or New Relic, they charge per metrics, and that's
Right.
because the dimensionality is very different, and that's a curse. And I mean, of the data space is that you have a lot of data and each of them contains a lot of metrics. Think about, take a numerical feature. You got histogram, you got, max, min, median. If you want to monitor each of them in traditional software space, it kind of falls apart pretty fast.
Okay.
And the second thing is the infrastructure part, yeah, where we don't have really well established infrastructure, kind of technology even. We have Qflow, MLflow, and SageMaker, but all of those are in development in a way that they're not. You don't see an established winner in the space. So what
Hmm.
I see when I talk to companies is that each company do their own kind of, I wouldn't call it Frankenstein, not in a negative term, but in more like, you do what you do to get your model to production kind of way. So Frankenstein infrastructure with like stitches of different parts of the ecosystem, from like basically they take pieces of
Right.
data ops, machine learning, and then software engineering and stitch them together to make it work. And then I think the third one is that a lot of best practices are established around code, but not data. And that's, I mean, nowadays there's some movement around that, but again, there's not established winner. And I think we are still in the very early journey of figuring out how to really manage the life cycle of data.
Right. I think this is like amazing insight in terms of, what's new, what is back then. And we have like tons of questions coming in for you, Andy. So
Yes.
first of all, let's greet a few folks. Moses is joining us. Hey Moses, nice to see you around. Christine is here from Chicago. We had about 8 inches of snow. It's still falling. Take care,
Wow.
Christine.
I'm
Yeah,
in
and
Seattle.
okay, yeah, exactly. So, obviously, I can see a lot of YLabs. So, for those who are just joining us, a quick reminder that YLabs has been kind, and we are, YLabs is giving away the swag. I was just saying the annual subscription, but it's about the swag today. So, go out and this is the swag that I'm mentioning about. So feel free to type in hashtag YLabs and you can win this swag. We'll be announcing the winners by end of the show. Okay, let's take these questions. A very interesting question from George Firikin. Let's take this one. Would YLabs work with cloud-based tools and also on premise?
Yes, because we separate the well, I'll go. I guess we'll talk about YLabs a bit later, but I'll just
Yeah.
give a very quick answer. Is that yes, we separate the telemetry collection, the kind of statistic collection, from the analysis of that. So it works. We work with companies who are completely off the grid in the kind of like private or VPC or private on-prem deployment all the time.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll want to hear obviously a lot more about
Yeah.
YLabs as well and about how that you guys are integrating. Nice question, George. Okay, let's take this one from Shruti Jain. How did you come up with YLabs as the name for the company? Interesting.
That's an interesting question. We actually started trying to figure out how to do explainability initially, like how to
Right.
explain the model, and so we went through a few prototypes, early iteration around explainability. But as we were building that, we realized that even without explainability, to being able to observe the data and being able to tell a story from by observing just the data alone without explainability is valuable to answer the question why. So this is basically, we think of it more like as a kind of operator of machine learning. how do you answer certain question, and that's why we ended up with the name YLabs. Yeah, and just fun story, when we first launched, obviously our name didn't appear on Google, so all people found out was YLabs are the best dogs in the world.
Right. Okay, fantastic. Interesting, backstory to the YLabs name, and it is definitely is very amazing. So let's take one another question from Aditi Kinvasra here. A great discussion. How are MLOps changing the face of machine learning today? Very interesting.
I think MLOps is pushing this turning into a discipline, and that forces a lot of conversations around, like, there are external conversations around compliance in the context of legal and kind of best practices framework. And MLOps, I think, is working in parallel with that to establish it from the execution perspective. So how do we
Right.
make people really build trust in machine learning? And that is something that I think that we are in the best place to drive those sort of conversations. Like, how do we build the like from within, we build the trust for people from outside to talk about machine learning, rather than being reactive around machine learning
Right.
failures, and you see like scary headlines on the newspaper. So that's my hope around MLOps being more established as a best practice, or as a field, as a discipline.
Okay, that's fair enough. And since we spoke about it earlier, it was not even a thing. Like, if I would say 5 years back, it wasn't even a thing, MLOps. But what was something where you felt maybe, okay, this is the place I want to focus, and what inspired you to be in this space, which is MLOps?
I think what inspired, so first of all, when I started working with data engineering, I love scale.
Right.
So while at Amazon, I guess not true for all companies, but it's not so rare nowadays that you work with scale and data. And what I see is that there's an opportunity to work to solve this problem at scale for the machine learning folks. And it's not like the traditional machine learning kind of workflow tend to start from Jupyter Notebook. So scaling tend to be an afterthought. And as an engineer, I want to help the kind of like, let's make this afterthought not an afterthought, and building best practices from the kind of like, when you do something in a local environment, you can still take it to scale without encountering too much friction. And I know that there are folks at companies like Ray, that teams like Ray and Dash are solving that, and
Right.
that's what get me really excited. The second part is figuring out the CI/CD story. What does it mean to talk about versions
Exactly.
and revision and rolling out new models, or iterate on your data pipelines? And in a way, data itself is ever changing. So how do you talk about versioning of data? Because in a way,
Exactly.
like, the data today is completely a new version compared to yesterday. And so that's I think that from the kind of philosophical perspective, I want to figure out how to tell that narrative better, and how to discuss that, like, because it all comes back to like traceability. Like, when you deploy a model, you build a model, how you figure out what where the data comes from, and how do you explain that kind of audit, when if you say to an end user. And finally, something that is not really engineering focused, but for me, like,
Right.
seeing other people working in the MLOps space, I realized a wide range of personas as end user. Data scientists not the only one who are interacted with machine learning models. In fact, we see even nowadays, because machine learning models are making business decisions, you get business stakeholders involved, and they don't necessarily have the same kind of expertise or expectations around data or machine learning as a traditional data scientist, or even between data scientists and software engineers. So you get like different slices of personas, and I want to figure out how to build a system that solve these challenges around persona like adoption, so that it's like MLOps is not something scary to say a key business stakeholders, because the machine learning is kind of making decisions around the business, but now they can't really interact with it. That just doesn't really build trust. I want to figure out the kind of user journey of how to connect other
Right.
non-ML practitioners into the domain.
Okay, these are very interesting and very inspiring, definitely for someone who wishes to get into MLOps. There are, like, obviously, Andy, you have given like five directions and five angles why you obviously have got into this field and what got you more intrigued about it. So, which is very cool, and thank you very much for that. Okay, let's take this question from audience. Very interesting one from coming from YouTube. Let's take this one. One advice you'll give to your younger self when you were entering into this field?
I think one thing I would give to myself is to be less opinionated about technology and be a lot more open-minded to rising technology. Full transparency, I was very skeptical of Apache Spark when it first came out
Oh my.
because I was like, we have a pipeline. Why do we need to change it? And then of course, like nowadays, I go around and talk to people about Apache Spark. So the world changes. And something to think about is to not think of technology in isolation, but in the context of ecosystem. It is like you
Fantastic.
want to learn the technology. You don't just look at the technology. I mean, sometimes it's fine to learn the technology. It's okay to learn it from the pure academic interest. But if you want to make it a career, either you build an ecosystem around it, or you figure out where that sits in the bigger ecosystem and how you can kind of operate in that. Like, would that ecosystem excite
Mm,
you? So don't look at software technology in isolation, but look at it as a whole. And of course, the technology is changing fast, but fundamentally, something I always also tell my younger self is that fundamentally everything stays underneath underneath the hood, pretty much the same core, except different kind of flavor, different
right.
take on top. Like just something I keep talking to other people who are like not familiar with like Hadoop system is that Spark, while fancy, it's just something that them just move like processing from disk to memory because memory got cheaper. But that's one key thing they executed around, and it made a multi-billion-dollar companies, Databricks. But underneath the hood is the same MapReduce principle. So
Right.
don't why you want to focus on new technology. Don't freak out too much. A lot of principles stay the same.
Exactly. And don't be opinionated about the new and rising technologies, because it will grow and you'll see those changes coming in. So
Yeah.
very nice, very interesting. And Gaurav completely says that's really cool advice. I agree. Technology is ever changing. Concepts and cores remain the same.
Yes.
Fantastic. Amazing. So, also taking this interesting question from Kalyan Prasad. Hi, Ravit. Hi, Andy. How MLOps is different for software developers, DevOps engineer, data science teams, and business leaders? Very interesting and very difficult, I know, to
Yes.
get that differentiation. Yeah.
Yeah, so how ML? So I think, to be fair, I wouldn't call like ML ops engineers non-software developers. I think they are a subcategory of software developers. They just
Exactly.
require a kind of It's a specialization of software development. It's not necessarily in this like excluding that. It's completely outside of that. It's not like
Mm,
data science where you can operate outside of like CI/CD cycle. In order to be a successful ML object engineers, you do need to embrace CI/CD. You need to embrace the kind of like at least certain level of disciplines around operational best practices. Like don't roll out your model in the middle of like Friday night because nobody else will take a look at it on Saturday, for example. So that's something I want to
exactly.
make it very clear there. But so for me, like from if you're a software developer, there's no like if you figure out the kind of like the right team and the right environment, you can definitely transition like specialize into ML ops further. But keep in mind that that doesn't stop you from going back to become another software developer if future opportunities presents themselves. I mean, the practices around ML ops are actually really transferable in terms of thinking
Right.
about data and operation as well. Like how do you monitor a data set? That's kind of data ops, ML ops question. But that doesn't like you can still bring some of those lessons into the traditional software engineer. In fact, that's the opposite I did. where we were trying to build a machine learning pipeline and a data pipeline. So not really machine learning, but it fits into a model, by the way. And the way we manage the data quality was actually doing a simple count of the row. So just to make sure that the join doesn't create any kind of like crazy explosion in the pipeline. And that was very simple metric from the DevOps perspective. But then nowadays, of course, we extend like in MLOps space, we extend on those metrics to talk about things like data drift. So it's an extension and a transition. Again, same core principle, but just different kind of take on top of that. And DevOps engineer, they feed into this. They feed into the MLOps lifecycle really well. Basically, they are kind of like partners to MLOps engineer. They are the consumer of these notifications, these kind of anomaly events. And data science team, this is more like from the MLOps perspective, we need to provide tooling to make it easy for scientists to access these information that are being processed, like pipeline staging and how to talk about the data health in each of the steps, because they're not going to be able to access, like, I don't know, they don't want to write SQL into Snowflake to do that. So how do we solve the friction? And business leaders, like, I think this is something I talked about personas before. How do we translate these? A lot of, like, take a subset of the signals that we collect in the MLOps lifecycle and translate into business KPIs. And if you can figure out that mapping to certain level, even as a kind of as a part of the team, that will allow business people to make decisions about AI rather than trust, like, I don't know, like having to run the query every time they want to take a look at a dashboard, for example.
Yeah, exactly. This is super insightful, and that definitely answers for Kalyan. Nice question, Kalyan. It does bring a lot of flavors in terms of the different roles and what type of obviously it's a big question out there when it comes to MLOps. There's a lot of I'm sure most of us here are who know like 10% or 20% of MLOps, and you are the master here, Andy. So we are loving all the insights that you are sharing coming firsthand from you. Also, we have an interesting question here from Shruti Jain. MLOps is already out there. What is the best roadmap for an engineer to get into MLOps?
Yeah, so first of all, you need Python because that is the core, right? It's not about the language itself, it's the ability to iterate really fast. So Python, and a lot of things are built on MLOps, like you can take MLflow and run it in Jupyter Notebook. So that's something, let's do a tons of Python tutorials in the context of MLOps. Maybe it's not about data processing at that point. It's more about how to use this library. So second thing is infrastructure. If you want to think about how to execute these libraries, this framework in the context of infrastructure, again, MLflow seems to be a good example because they're very low-hanging fruit. I know there are a bunch of other libraries as well that like Prefect that allows you to get a sense of like data pipeline and flow and how to and of course containerization technology, because that is the core of how most companies deploy models these days. And of course, all the cloud technologies like SageMaker or Google AI are built around like Docker containers, or at least like container-based technology. So, and then finally, thinking about building like in terms of like the kind of like data, like having the skill to at least like transform data. And I think Pandas API is the best, and that's actually there's a big convergence of technology towards Pandas-based APIs these days. So that's something I don't think will hurt you in any ways, for example.
Okay, that's fantastic. Nice question, Shruti. Thanks for that answer, Andy. It definitely brings a lot around the roadmap as well. And those, obviously you mentioned about the languages, that is very important, so which makes a lot of sense. Another quick question here, in terms of more on the side where it's about the futuristic bit, Manisha is asking, where do you see MLOps in the next 2 to 3 years? Interesting.
I see a lot of kind of like, so MLOps started in kind of from the bottom up, where model training and deployment is happening. But I think I see a trend of going back to the source of the data stream. So not convergence, but a kind of meet in the middle between data ops space and MLOps space, where we're going to try to figure out how to bring scale of the data into the machine learning deployment and training pipelines and how do we connect with tool space is very important question. I mean, we have a few tools. An example one I see just recently launched is Apache Spark Pandas API. So the idea is that you can take your Pandas notebook and just wrap or put it in Apache Spark cluster and run it at scale, for example. So that's the kind of convergence I see. And then also I can see a few cloud providers like Snowflake, for example, launch Snowpark still in preview, I think. Recently, that allows you to run Python in against a massive database. So you kind of bring MLOps closer to the data. So of course, data is very expensive to move around. So you will bring the code towards it. And that I want to see what I see is that the kind of convergence of these tooling. And of course, that comes with the challenge of how to connect the pipeline and how do we talk about versioning and deployment. Those are still a bit of unanswered questions. So keep an eye out for those tools who are trying to solve the kind of like CI/CD and kind of observability problems.
Okay, that's fantastic. Very nice to hear those futuristic goals as well, and would love to see how MLOps space obviously evolves over the next 2 to 3 years. Very interesting space to have a look at. And let's take this one about something around the project. So Ketan is asking any suggestion to start practice on real world ML projects for beginners.
Yeah, I think this is something I guess we're missing a Kaggle for MLOps because or playground for MLOps. I think that might be a fun product to build. But MLOps, as I mentioned, is not just about like a Jupyter notebook. It sits in the context of infrastructure. So what
Right.
I would recommend people to take a look is to first of all pick. I would recommend to a very low hanging fruit. To be honest, for me, I really love this technology is MLflow because you can do it in the Jupyter Notebook environment. But then a lot of cloud providers also have hosted MLflow instances like Azure, and you can then
Right.
apply this, like try to map it to the cloud provider practice best, or at least infrastructure, because that's where real machine learning is going to be deployed. And then MLflow also takes you to the deployment pipeline. So that is a good kind of like, and it actually involves containerization. And so it involves a lot of components that in a normal MLOps pipeline. I'm not saying that it's the best pipeline out there. Don't view it as the kind of golden standard, but it is very flexible and it's widely adopted, at least the training part. So that's a good start. Also, a lot of companies like including us, YLabs, are providing free tier for various various experimentation and training pipelines. So those are also good to try out in terms of how to, because they're free, you're not obligated. And also, I think some cloud providers also provide credits. That's where I would play like SageMaker, for example.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks for that information, Andy. Okay. Also, since we've spoken a lot around MLOps, how it will be evolving, how the space, the difference between the space that you were in earlier and now. So also, there's always with a lot of new technology that comes in. There comes a lot of difficulties as well. So, want to take switch gears towards about the big challenges and want to learn more about what are the big challenges that you see in the MLOps space right now.
Right now is the biggest challenge I see is handling hosted models in streaming or real-time context. That if you want to be very specific, that or in deployment to IoT devices. When I talk to people about those challenges, especially IoT devices, actually, people tend to just like let the model go and hope that it will work. There's very little kind of governance and observability and monitoring in that particular area. And even for streaming use cases, because of the low latency requirements, it makes it really, really hard for a lot of companies to monitor it. We talked to one company who generates like 2 terabytes of logs from their training pipeline, but because they run it in AWS, but their analytics are done in Google. And so they basically throw away all the logs because it's super expensive to transfer 2 terabytes a day from one cloud provider to another, for example. So, and even without, even if you could, like within one cloud provider, it's still very expensive to run analysis against that much data. So I see that it's like kind of like after the model is deployed, it's kind of like uh, fingers crossed kind of mode with a lot of teams at the moment that is kind of a bit scary, to be honest,
Mhm.
from that context. That's the
Okay.
biggest challenge. It's like people don't, either maybe they might feel the need, but I don't think there's a strong discipline around like you need to do this. Unlike in DevOps, like you need to put some health check for your container when you deploy a service, for example.
Very interesting, and those are fantastic insights. Also, that also brings me to an interesting question. Even though with the challenges, why do you see MLOps space is picking so fast? What's the reason behind it? In terms of, like, obviously, I know for a fact we are coming from a engineering background, so I wouldn't want
Hmm.
to get you towards more on the business side, but still, like, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts around it?
I think first of all, the barrier to entry for getting a model out is very low these days. Like you get pre-built model out of the shelf. You get in the open source
Hmm.
community as well as you can purchase one easily from a third party. So that's one thing. I see a lot of companies just doing that. Like they build by a text recognition model, and also
Right.
the kind of like standardization of deployment in terms of container based deployment. Not necessarily that makes them easy to track, but at least it's super easy to deploy a container to a cloud
Right.
provider or Kubernetes cluster. So that makes hosting a model also very low barrier for the DevOps team. They don't need to know anything about ML. They just say, here's the container, here's the service endpoint, just host it. That's all the DevOps team need to know. They didn't need to know like, oh, you're using back then in my days, well, I'm not that old, but I'm going to use that joke. Back in 2014, I had to know the details of the models, like, oh, how to load it from S3, how to plug it into this specific interface to actually like deploy it. And now you can't just hand it over to a DevOps team. That you need to kind of know a lot more, and containerization makes it really easy to both deploy and scale. So that's
Yeah.
why and also the kind of convergence of technology, or maybe more like the support of models on multiple architecture, especially ARM.
Mhm.
So you can deploy models into various devices, low power devices. That makes it really easy to get models everywhere, and that makes also like kind of just kind of like different the same kind of business need, but now they can execute it differently. So that's why you see the kind of the rise of AI everywhere. In a way, my what I'm seeing is that AI is eating the world, like just
Yes,
getting everywhere.
exactly. And I totally agree with you, Andy, there. That's very interesting. And that's one of the reasons, definitely, one of many reasons why people want to, get into this space and why it is growing. Also, there was an interesting question from the audience that said, yes, this is very interesting question from Gaurav Jain. He's asking, what's your take on AutoML?
I I think ROML is a good place to start if you don't have like a big team to really manage like
Right.
training pipeline and tuning. Tuning is expensive, by the way. It takes a lot of hardware, it takes a lot of resources and infrastructure. Not that AutoML services are cheap, but at least you just hand it over to a cloud provider and they will figure it out for you. It will work if your business domains are fits in certain traditional category. It kind of falls apart once you have like certain specific business requirements that need more kind of like tuning around or transformation that make it very, once you start doing like feature transformation, that to turn like the feature to map it into like business specific domain. For example, one of the customers we talked to deal with like company names, and there are so many formats,
Hmm.
and they need to normalize them. And once they start building embeddings to normalize these companies, because they need to predict it two kind of strings the same, like Amazon and Amazon.com, are they the same company or not? Then they might as well just build an ML team. So it
Right.
really depends. I think for if your team is small and you have one or two scientists, AutoML is a great place to start, but you'll
Right.
hit the kind of limitation of how much configurations you can have with AutoML down the road. So yeah, it's a good place to think about ML as a part of your business, but it might not be where you want to end up to be.
Yeah, definitely it is. Those were very interesting insights. Thanks for sharing those, Andy, on auto ML. It does make a lot of sense. Okay, that also brings me to a very important question about, can you tell us more about YLabs? Like, we've been talking about MLOps, data observability. I know YLabs does a lot around it. So would love to
Yes.
hear what's why, something about YLabs.
Yeah, let me just present to you with the kind of how I think about machine
Yeah,
learning observability architecture should look like. Is
right.
that what we see is that what we're doing at YLabs is trying to solve the first and foremost the observability problem, and then secondly the monitoring problem. So start with observability. I think somebody was asking about how we work in terms of on-prem or on the cloud. We actually start with the telemetry part. This is how companies like Datadog and New Relic work, where they, for the DevOps space, they collect telemetry, which are just statistical objects about the data, like the distribution, the frequent items, the unique count. All of these are lightweight telemetry objects that are collected in an open source library we call YLabs. And that allow us to, and
Right.
these telemetry objects are designed in a very flexible way that can work in batch streaming, in training, or in kind of even in IoT devices. So it's very infrastructure agnostic. And the reason I mentioned before is because we don't have well-defined infrastructure. And even then, the mode of operation depends so much on the business needs that you can't really make an assumption about the data flow. So we make it really lightweight to collect telemetry using a library called YLabs. It's in GitHub. You can search for YLabs on GitHub here. And once that telemetry object is collected, then user can store and process it themselves in their own infrastructure. We have a few open source users like Yahoo Japan and Stitch Fix who are doing that. And then
Nice.
and then you can, and these objects, you can merge them, you can compare them, that allow you to have this kind of end-to-end view of your data. And what we do at YLabs is that we build a time series data store around this telemetry object. So this fits into the kind of coarse grain high level overview of the data health and model health. And this allows a user to then query and build dashboards around them, and then we can also run a lot of automated uh, kind of monitoring processes across a large scale of kind of models and features. So we don't just do it across a single feature or single metric. We do it across everything and then build kind of overall data health out of that. And the output can then trigger a new model training pipeline or feed into the machine learning scientist or the DevOps user workflow. And that's how we believe it should be from the kind of like observability perspective, is that you can deploy this anywhere and everywhere from the kind of integration perspective. And just a very quick overview of YLabs platform. We organize things in models at the moment because this is what a lot of users care about. And what you see here is automated alerts that we configure this particular organization to have like 4 kinds of monitors around like things like distribution. And all of these are run against statistical data and not actual raw data. So you never actually you collect raw data in these telemetry objects, because first of all, if you do, they will be very, very big. And secondly, it's probably not a good practice in general to duplicate and store your data in 2 places. You want to like think about DevOps. You already store the kind of telemetry information. And take a look at the model dashboard. We kind of like run these monitors at scale, and this is something I mentioned about the curse of dimensionalities. For each of these features, we run monitors on at least here 4 metrics, but a few of other users do it on even more metrics like min max, standard deviation. They depending on really what they need to monitor. And if you collect it by day, we can then monitor like here the quantile distribution chart that allows you to kind of like see the big drift in quantile. You can see the quantile kind of collapses here, and that that shows that the distance we use like Hellinger distance, but can be some other kind of distance algorithm that you want, like KS test or KL divergence. And we monitor other kind of data quality as well. So this is what I said about the overlaps of data ops and ML ops, is that when you start monitoring your model, you need to kind of monitor the data health as well, on top of things like model performance and ROC curve. So those are important, but then the input to, or even the output of the model, just from the pure data health perspective, are super important signals that you want user to that you want to kind of like keep constant eyes around. So
Nice.
that's a very quick demo, and we have a free tier that you can try out, but you can also just start with YLabs if you want. And this doesn't connect to our infrastructure. This is an open source library. Yeah, we focus on making logging data very lightweight, and very like the idea is that every time, for example, if you take a look at our ML flow example here, you can just log every time you do a training step, for example, and that allows you to create a kind of audit trail around the data without storing the actual data set with your training, because again, that is very expensive. So check it out. It's actually available in multiple languages as well, because machine learning happens in multiple languages. You've got Python, Scala, Apache Spark, and Java, of course.
This is fantastic. Thanks for this quick demo. I'm sure the folks kind of learned a lot around it. In Manisha says it's a great demo, Andy. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Amazing coming from Shruti. Also, for those who wish to obviously learn more about it, I've shared the YLabs link with you in the chat, so you can go and check out the GitHub repo, and obviously if you like it, put out a start there. And appreciate the work that Andy and his team has been doing. Also, let's take this question from Karthik, actually, from YouTube. I think you have said most of the technology is working based on some principles or concepts. So how could you explain on what are the different domain concepts available? How could we see? Okay.
This is the big question. I think that first and foremost, I think there's a kind of like, okay, so there are two parts you want to talk about here. One is software development lifecycle, like DevOps. Like MLOps is two things, like data and then lifecycle. And if you look at the kind of deployment cycle, the CI/CD lifecycle, I would recommend checking out the software development lifecycle. They don't map one-to-one into MLOps, but the principle stays the same. You have pipelines, you have stages, you have things like integration tests, staging. With models, it's kind of the. In traditional software, you call them like one box testing, like when you deploy a service. But in machine learning, you call them A/B testing. So if you kind of like squint, they kind of start looking the same. So I wouldn't go into the details because it's very well documented out there. The second part is data ops. So a lot of the concepts in data and how we frame like data operations, we start with like data. To be honest, a lot of things start with like SQL-based system. So that's like you talk about table, or a pandas data frame operates similar to tables. And if you look at certain open source library, they operate on these data frames or tables using very similar operations called transformations, and so on and so forth. So we can, if your background is more traditional software engineer and database system, take a look at those concepts, and then they map really nicely into the MLOps space. And of course, once you have that, then how you connect them, that's where MLOps differ quite a bit, but not like significantly, but like there's a different kind of flavor, different take on those.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I'm sure it helps Karthik a lot. A very detailed information. Thanks for that, Andy. Also, Moses is here. He's thanking for the amazing and valuable information that you've been sharing, Andy. Thanks for that. Okay, let's also wanted to know more about the future plans of YLabs. What are you planning in terms of what are the new developments that are happening on your platform? What's next that's coming in that the audience could be excited for?
So first and foremost, this is not really YLab specific, but more like on the open source part as well. What we're building is YLabs, is to follow where the data is. So we want to be, for example, go to the data source, like things like Kafka, Apache Spark, Apache Flink, anywhere the big data transformation is happening, we want to be there and just start collecting telemetry. The second part is, and then they're also dealing with things like complex data sources and infrastructure, streaming infrastructure and real-time infrastructure. And then the second part is one of the things about YLabs is that we collect only telemetry data. So we want to make these telemetry objects even more secure by doubling down on privacy and security best practices. We believe there's an opportunity here for company to really think about like we have a use case where DevOps team want to monitor data health because they are in charge of the kind of infrastructure, but they are not allowed to look at the data. And this is where YLabs approach really shines, because you only collect telemetry data. You don't need to collect the actual raw data. And that's where YLabs fits into that picture as well, like helping people achieve security and privacy from both legal and best business practices. And then finally, the flexibility for the platform is to extend to where the biggest machine learning challenges are, like embeddings, like the complex data types for that we are dealing with these days, like audio embeddings, images. So we want to really extend the platform to support those very complex use cases. We have like a lot of work in progress, but we want to make them really visible and really easy to use to plug into various like PyTorch and TensorFlow infrastructure.
Fantastic. Thanks for that information, Andy, and looking forward to the great developments that will be happening at YLabs, YLogs. So can't wait. Okay, let's do a quick raffle for the audience. It's time we should, do the raffle where the audience kind of, let's see who the winner is. Let me bring the screen up here very quickly. All right, we have 13 entries. All the best to those who have entered into the raffle. You win, the YLabs cool swag. So can't wait. Let's do this drum roll. Let's see who the winner is. So it comes according to the chat. One who puts in a hashtag in the chat. It's been collected there, Andy, and the winner is Paul Siegel. Awesome, Paul. All the best. I'll reach out to you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, you win the cool swag from YLabs. Thank you very much for participating, everyone. If you still wish to get cool swags, reach out to Andy and request him for that. I'm sure he'll be happy to send over to you. And don't forget to check out YLabs, the website as well. Don't forget to check out the
community. We have a community Slack as well. So if you don't know how to reach me, you can always ping me there. I'm always around there.
Okay, that's very helpful, Andy. Thank you very much. And before we wrap this up, very quick, 2 questions. One question around what's your recommendation for people who want to transition into MLOps? What would you suggest?
Yeah, learn Python, play around with Jupyter Notebook, learn some cloud infrastructure technology, because those are really meaningful combination, and learn maybe a database technology as well.
Okay. Fantastic. Very, very nice recommendations. And the last question is obviously you've answered, which is more around the side where people can find you. One is the YLabs Slack channel. If not, there is LinkedIn a comfortable place to reach out to you, Andy?
Yes, I am on LinkedIn I think there's only one Andy Dang in MLOps space, so it's not so hard to find. So find me on LinkedIn as well. And or just shoot me an email at andy@ylabs.ai.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Andy. This was super insightful. I'm sure the audience loved it. Thanks to everyone for joining and asking such amazing questions. It was super insightful. And with the questions, obviously, it gets too insightful. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, Ravit.